next group that we're going to hear from is No Labels. No Labels is a group that is working to bring bipartisan reform, get past some of the partisanship that has caused so many of the problems we've been hearing about so far today. And I'm delighted to introduce Dan Gerstein, one of the founding members of No Label. They have over 460,000 members, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and probably a range of other parties, the Rent is Too Damn High Party and others. So with no further ado, Dan, it's my pleasure to introduce you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I sort of feel like looking at some of the roster of people involved, Mickey Edwards and Buddy Roemer and the esteemed Nathan Daschle, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later. It's a little like going to a political AA meeting. I want to say my name's Dan Gerstein. I'm a recovering Washingtonian. I want to tell you a little bit about why I joined No Labels, and then a little bit about the work No Labels is doing to try and fix our broken political system. And I like to use the term not so much focus on bipartisanship, but to make this country safe for democracy again. We made the world safe for democracy, but over the last several decades, we watched our own democracy fall into disrepair for a lot of reasons we've been, you all have been talking about today. And then I'll close with just a little bit about how people who are interested in No Labels or through other venues can make their voice heard and start to try and affect change. And then I'm happy to take a few questions. I worked in Capitol Hill for Senator Lieberman for 10 years, left in 2004, was totally disgusted and fed up with Washington, felt the place was fundamentally broken, but at least took some comfort from knowing it couldn't get any worse. Boy, was I wrong. One of the things I learned fairly early on in Washington was, we talk about a lot of different reasons for why the system is broken. But one thing I think a lot of people fail to realize is the system is broken and the incentives are all wrong and perverse. All the incentives that we have baked into the system structurally are all geared towards tribalism, hyperpartisanship, trying to tear the other side down and gaining partisan advantage. None of the incentives in the system are there to encourage cooperation, collaborative work, and finding common ground to find solutions. Once you start to realize that, a lot of the kind of peripheral issues that we talk about, the media that fosters food fights, the growing ideological sorting that's happening in this country. There are a lot of different things that are feeding the hyperpartisanship. But I would contend to you that more than anything, it's the fact that we have rules, laws, procedures that are all geared towards locking this in. And in that environment, if you have hard partisans on both sides trying to gain partisan advantage, there's nothing you can do to change it unless you change those incentives. And that's what really No Labels was formed to do. It was a group of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents who saw what was happening in our political system, the dysfunction, the hyperpartisanship, and the consequences of it, and saw that if the folks in this country who believe that the hyperpartisanship is out of control and having this destructive effect do not make their voice heard and do not change the incentive system, then we're going to continue to slide. And even more importantly, these big challenges, big national challenges, these big global challenges that we're not addressing are just going to continue to fester. So what No Labels has begun to do is to fill this vacuum and to give a platform to re-empower the majority of American citizens who are not, do not view the people of the other party or of different parties as the enemy. They may have differences, they might have passionate differences, but they don't buy into this tribal mentality that has gripped Washington. And they're doing it through a number of ways. One is by becoming an institutional voice in Washington in some of these political debates, but more importantly, organizing people in their communities. We now have chapters in every state. We have chapters we have leaders in every congressional district. By the end of the year, we're going to be close to, if not at our goal of having 1 million members, which is a critical threshold to show strength. What we're doing is giving these people not just a voice, but a feeling of empowerment that they can affect change, that they can have, through the collective voice of a lot of people like them who are not part of an interest group, who are not part of the Tea Party movement or Move On as two examples of political organizations that have mobilized and have had an effect, that their voice can be heard. But one of the things that we quickly realized was that to really galvanize people was it was important that rather than just complain about what's happening in Washington, to offer a reform agenda, right? To give something that people could mobilize around and buy into, and believe that by getting active and getting engaged, they could actually change the system and change the incentives, as I talked about before. So we developed a 12-point plan called Make Congress Work, and unveiled it a few months ago in Washington. And the lead item of that, which is getting a lot of traction, is a really simple concept called no budget, no pay. We haven't had a budget in Washington, I think in now 3 or 4 years. Again, it's a complete abdication of responsibility. And of course, all the incentives are to not be responsible. All the incentives are to punt on these tough financial decisions. And so what we're trying to do with no budget, no pay is just have a simple common sense reform that says if you don't fulfill your responsibility, it's Congress's responsibility, legal responsibility to pass a budget. They're defying their own rules, that there will be a consequence and you're not going to get paid. And it's using the simple logic that a lot of Americans would really identify with. It's like you don't show up at work, you don't do your job, you're not going to get paid. But that's just the first of the 12 reforms. I'm going to kind of summarize these quickly. And again, these are all tied to changing the incentives, changing the structural problems we have that bake partisanship into the system, that discourage cooperation and collaboration, and actually, keep the two sides, the two parties apart, and discourage them from talking to each other even. And also to again, re-empower the majority in this country who want congressional bipartisanship. So in terms of breaking the partisan gridlock, another simple reform, up and down vote on presidential appointments, right? Both sides have been guilty of this. They've realized that they can manipulate the rules, whether it's the filibuster or anything else, to block the president from filling key slots. So this reform would simply prevent that from happening by saying you have to have an up and down vote in the Senate on confirmable nominees within 90 days. And if you don't have the vote within 90 days, by default, the nominee is automatically confirmed. Number 3 is filibuster reform. It's this crazy thing that was never meant to be part of the, it's not part of the Constitution. It was something that the Senate created as a way to protect minority rights, but has been abused beyond all recognition. We all have this idea, Mr. Smith goes to Washington, you have to go to the Senate floor and you have to hold the floor and filibuster, but that's not the way it works. Is anyone who just raises their hand privately to the leader of their caucus and says, I don't like that bill, can effectively launch a filibuster and block the majority from happening in the Senate. So we're just proposing a simple reform that if you're going to filibuster, you got to go to the floor of the Senate and hold the floor, just like it was originally designed to do. Number 4, empower the sensible majority. There is a number of pieces of legislation that have bipartisan majority support, but never get to the floor, never see the light of day because the leader of one caucus, the other, doesn't like it, feels like it will go against their party's interests, not the national interest, and so they bottle it up. And this would just simply say if you can show there's bipartisan majority support for a piece of legislation, you can bring it to the floor. Number 5, make members come to work. And again, another crazy idea that members of Congress should actually show up and do their jobs and legislate and go to committee hearings. But as we all know from the demands of whether it's fundraising, going to political events, that the number of days that Congress is actually in session, Mickey would know this better than I would, but that has shrunk dramatically. And one of the consequences of that is it's not just that work's not getting done, but there's not the safe space for members of the House and Senate of different parties to actually talk to each other and get to know one another and develop trust. There's a massive trust deficit at work. And this reform would simply say that they're going to schedule a 3 weeks on in Washington and 1 week off. Again, leaving plenty of time to go to for members to go to their district, to talk to their constituents, but to their primary responsibility to be in Washington and to do their work. And then there's another series of reforms that are tied around, again, to promoting bipartisan collaboration and conversation. Number 6, question time for the president. And if any of you watch the BBC and you see the question time where the British Prime Minister goes before Parliament, what it does is it forces the two sides, and the two branches of government to actually engage and have conversation. We rarely have that anymore. And this would institutionalize an opportunity for the president and in particularly the minority party to engage and have public conversation and debate and dialogue. And we believe that would go a long way towards beginning to foster bipartisan conversation and dialogue. Number 7, one of the biggest problems we have around our financial situation is the two different sides often use conflicting numbers, conflicting reports. They can't even agree on the baseline that we're talking about, how big the debt is, how big the deficit is, what percentage of GDP tax revenues are, things like that. So a simple reform is come up with an independent, developed fiscal report that would be presented to Congress, and the leadership of both parties would have to sign it, just like a CEO of a company now is required to sign their financial statements, so that it would have legitimacy and would not be viewed as the instrument of one party or the other. All right. In an effort to reduce polarization and to kind of liberate members from the pressure of interest groups, a simple reform, no pledge but the oath of office. You may be familiar with Grover Norquist and his Americans for Tax Reform pledge that binds one party from agreeing to any tax increase, no matter what. There are interest groups on both sides that have proliferated with these pledges, and what that does is it just exacerbates the problem of hyperpartisanship and rigidity when it comes to trying to find common ground. So the no-label solution is let's get rid of all these pledges and limit the only pledge to the oath of office. Number 9, again, to create more bipartisan dialogue, we're calling for institutionalization of monthly bipartisan gatherings. To have the House and Senate leadership get together on a regular basis. Number 10, bipartisan seating. You may have heard about this at the State of the Union. There was an effort after the horrible shooting in Arizona to kind of lower the partisan temperature. And one way to do that was just to, rather than have the two parties separated at the State of the Union, to actually sit next to one another and for members of different parties. We want to try and extend that throughout the workings of Congress. Number 11, bipartisan leadership committee. Again, another way to institutionalize bipartisan dialogue to require the leaders of both parties to get together on a regular basis. And number 12, no negative campaigns against incumbents. The idea being that if these folks have to work together on a regular basis, every 2 years they shouldn't be going out on the campaign trail and attacking someone else from the other party, whether it's from their own state or another state. And wouldn't limit them from campaigning for someone in their own party, but it would just stop this practice of, if it's, a senator from Connecticut, my home state, not going in and campaigning against his colleague. So that's it. Those are the 12 reforms from Make Congress Work. One of the things we're doing right now is trying to activate people to call on their members of Congress to support the no budget, no pay legislation. There's going to be a hearing coming up, I believe it's March 14th, in the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, which my former boss, Senator Lieberman, chairs. And they're going to be looking at not only no budget, no pay, but a few other congressional reforms aimed at, some of which are on the No Labels Make Congress Work plan, a few others outside of it. And we're seeing a lot of interest in no budget, no pay. It's really energizing people. One good example is Claire McCaskill is a senator from Missouri. She's on the Governmental Affairs Committee. She has not taken a position yet on this legislation. And we have been able to, through her Facebook page, emails, phone calls, mobilize a lot of people inside Missouri and outside of Missouri, calling on her, not attacking her, but just calling on her and encouraging her to support this piece of legislation. And it's also led to one of the biggest papers in Missouri coming out with an editorial in support of the legislation, it's clearly getting her attention. And that's what I want to leave you with, and happy to take questions about this, is the power of individuals to actually get change in Washington is so much greater than everyone thinks. If you call your member of Congress, you email them, you change the incentives ultimately for them about votes. And if you convey to them that if they don't support no budget, no pay, if they don't support other ideas to reform Congress, to reduce the hyperpartisanship, they may lose their seat. You'll be surprised at how quickly they'll change their tune. I was struck by, many of you know Olympia Snowe, the senator from Maine, resigned, announced she was going to be resigning and not running for re-election. And she had an op-ed in the Washington Post, which was, I think, in many ways very discouraging for people, because her view was things are so bad that the Senate can't fix itself, and it's going to stay that way for a long time. But what she also said is that people from outside, and that's what she's going to try and do, people from outside can have a dramatic impact if they just make their voice heard. And that's one of the things that No Labels is very much focused on, is energizing people, giving them strength in numbers, and again, changing the incentive structure, both within Congress and the congressional reforms I talked about, but ultimately when it comes to elections, is letting people know that if they do not change their ways, if they do not break through the hyperpartisanship, and actually collaborate, there will be consequences. There will be electoral consequences, and that ultimately will get their attention. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
All these initiatives are really well and good, and I think we could probably support them all wholeheartedly, but how are you going to get our legislators to legislate these initiatives when it's against their self-serving interests? Wouldn't you be better off advocating the one overall initiative? And this is where you've heard me before explain about what score voting can do. I have a website called Voting Insanity, and it's a simple 3-page website. You can see quickly what this is all about. But basically, with score voting, we, the people, would have an expanded voting system method by which everybody would have a level playing field. It would totally eliminate partisanship, because the candidates could run directly from the people. We could elect anybody we wanted, and it wouldn't necessarily be a majority wins person. I mean, Hitler himself could have won a majority, but that didn't mean he was a great guy. So we really want the most generally preferred candidate who might not win any first place votes. But he's the guy, like Buddy Roemer might be, who would institute these kinds of things. So do you think that might be an initiative that you folks would like to get behind? Changing the voting method, which I think would be a lot easier than getting campaign finance reform, which needs a constitutional amendment. Voting reform could be done state by state. Just write the new law in 2 simple sentences.
Well, The short answer is I don't know. I'd be happy to take a look at it. I'm a big fan of interesting ideas, so I will not dismiss anything out of hand. But let me address your first question, though, because that is a really important question, which is how do you get these reforms passed when most members of Congress will look at this and kind of go, well, I kind of like things the way they are. They kind of make things easy for me, or they protect my seat, all these things. You have to change the incentive system for them.
That's right.
And on the outside, that looks kind of hard, but I believe it's much easier than people think. And again, we're seeing it with this example. That's one of the reasons why the example with Claire McCaskill I raised. My bet is at the end of the day, she will come out and support that legislation because she's in a tough reelection fight. And a lot of people are weighing in, and she will see that it's in her interest, because if she opposes no budget, no pay, no one's going to pat her on the back. No one's going to give her a bunch of donations. But if she supports it, she's going to energize a lot of people on her behalf. And ultimately, you talk about all these reforms. One of the reasons why we pick them is because almost all of them, except for no budget, no pay, can happen in one day next January when the new Congress comes in, because the Congress sets its own rules. They could just, with one vote, adopt all these in the space of one day, and it would have a dramatic impact. So how does that happen? Well, people have to make their voice heard. And again, it's not that difficult. If you look at what happened with the SOPA legislation, you had Congress greased by special interests, ready to pass a piece of legislation that wasn't really debated, and obviously was a concern to a lot of Americans. There was a great mobilization campaign that leveraged social media. There was a massive backlash. And what happened? The legislation got pulled. It got defeated.
Yeah.
Purely by less than 1 million Americans making their voice heard, that they actually changed the incentive system. So is there any other questions? All right, time for one more.
Can you hear?
I
Can you hear it? Okay. So I have a very soft voice, like naturally, and for years of my life, people have told me to speak up. At a certain age, I tried to sort of shout what felt like shouting to me, until I developed a very interesting strategy that I realized worked for me, because I didn't have to shout. I would just speak at my normal tone of voice. At a certain point, people would start to come toward me to hear what I had to say. And I think that I agree that the power of people is way, way more than what they realize. And I think that even great advocacy groups like these and advocacy campaigns are still in these awkward positions where they're trying to mobilize people, like it's still from some epicenter to the people. And I've rarely seen it, except maybe in the SOPA case, where people really kind of come from themselves to their representatives. And as much as I love and support these kinds of initiatives, it still seems like there's an awkwardness here where you're trying to persuade the people to take an action. And I do have some modest proposals for how to change that. I don't know if there's enough time or anyone actually wants to hear. But I think that's the shift that might be the powerful key to. And the thing is that we do have social media. We do have these technology tools that didn't exist even 10 years ago, and they are immensely powerful. And I think, I hang out with tech people, so I know a little bit about the fact that tech people and government people don't really understand what the others do. So that's part of the problem. But I do think that the answers come from the technology tools we already have.
Okay.
And I think those voices are going to become more and more powerfully heard.
I agree with you 100% about that. But let me try and answer your question real quick, and then Brian wants me to wrap up. So why do we have to have these organizations to get people to act in their self-interest, right? It is a good question. And it's a personal frustration of mine because I think a lot of citizens are disengaged and they don't take their citizenship responsibilities seriously. At the same time, I can't blame them because the system's so broken and there's so many examples of politicians ignoring people's voices and doing what's in the interest of special interests, that there's so much cynicism and feeling of disenfranchisement and disempowerment that people have pulled back, and a lot of them have just given up. They think neither party speaks for them, and that they have no opportunity to engage. Right? So no matter one person, their vote, they feel it's pointless. And what No Labels in particular, but not just No Labels, I think a lot of these organizations try and do is to say to these people, if you band together, that your voice can very quickly make a difference. And to, if you look at what happened with SOPA, if you look what happened with Planned Parenthood, those were specific instances where people's interests were threatened, and it was clear that there was a imminent threat. There was something specific. It was easier for people to respond to and rally around. With something like massive fundamental change in our political system, there's not one thing. There's not a concrete threat. It's something that's sort of diffuse. And to really mobilize people the way that we've seen in some of these specific cases, you have to convince people first that they can affect change, and then secondly, give them something to rally around. And that's exactly what No Labels is trying to do. All right, well, thank you very much. I'm sorry I didn't get to more of your questions. Oh, I would be an idiot if I didn't say, go to the No Labels website if you're interested in learning more, nolabels.org. We'd love to have your support and check it out. Thank you.